I'm not going to give John's full bio. I want him to have as much time as possible to talk to you guys. I wish we had 2 or 3 hours to listen to John. This John Baker done just a tremendous amount of research on this place. One of the best genealogists and historians that you'll find. Just had, based on his work, the Tennessee State Museum did a tremendous exhibit on this property that then became a traveling exhibit. So we're very fortunate to have him in our community, have him to speak with our group today, and want to save as much time for you, and they're going to have lots of questions.
Okay,
so
great.
Thank you, John, for being here today.
I'm John Baker, the author of The Wessyngtons of Wessyngton Plantation, Stories of My Family's Journey to Freedom, which my family goes back here more than 200 years. My research started when I was in the 7th grade, flipping through a social studies textbook called Your Tennessee, and I came to this page. And for some reason, this caught my fascination because at that time, not much was talked about African American history. However, I had no idea that I was looking at my own great-great-grandfather. Wow. So shortly after I got out of school for summer vacation, it was the plantation's 160th anniversary. So they had a photograph of the white Wessyngton family that established the plantation, and the same photograph that was in my social studies textbook. So my maternal grandmother was visiting with me and my mother, and she spent the weekend with one of her older brothers here in Cedar Hill. And so she told my mother to have me to bring the camera out because she had something she wanted me to copy. And I said, Mama, what does Big Mama want me to bring the camera out to Uncle Bob's for? She said, boy, get that camera and you'll find out when you get there. So when I got there, she showed me the newspaper article, and I said, Big Mama, that picture's in our social studies textbook. Who is that? So she pointed to the gentleman seated, and she said, that's my grandfather. He was the cook at Wessyngton, and that's why we got the Wessyngton name. And she said, that was my grandmother. So she was excited to see the picture as well because she was the baby for her family. She didn't know her grandparents, but her brother was about 15 years older than she was, and he knew them personally. So he said, will you call out to Wessyngton and tell them who you are? I said, they still live in the big house, the white Wessyngtons. All the buildings are still there, everything, the cemetery, everything pretty much as it was in the 1800s. So I called and I spoke to Ann Consolvin Talbot, who was a 6th generation descendant of the founder of the plantation, and I told her that I'd seen the photograph and I was interested in my family's history. So she invited me out, and she said, everyone knows who your great-great-grandfather was because we still have his portrait in the living room, and I'll show you a copy of it. Wessyngton was established in 1796 by Joseph Washington, and he came from Southampton County, Virginia, bringing enslaved African Americans with him. And this is his wife, Mary Cheatham. Cheatham County is named for some of her family members. This is their son, George A. Washington, who was born here in 1815. And that building there, which was the kitchen, the Washingtons lived in that until the mansion was completed. It was started in 1815 and completed in 1819. When I first came out, Miss Talbot brought out about 12 legal-sized documents like this, which listed the births of slaves on the plantation from 1795 to 1860. So I was able to find my great-great-grandfather and mother's exact dates of birth and some of our early ancestors as well. And this is a portrait of my great-great-grandfather, Emmanuel Washington, and he was born here April 23rd, 1824, and he died here in 1907, and he was the cook. This this portrait was painted by Maria Howard Wheaton, who specialized in painting African Americans during the late 1800s, early 1900s. And this portrait now, the original portrait, is worth about $25,000. When I met Miss Talbot, she told me that the Washington family had deposited all the records from the plantation in the Tennessee State Library and Archives in the 1960s. This is on 69 rolls of microfilms, over 11,000 documents, and I've gone through all of these documents many times, not only tracing my ancestry, but all the families that were enslaved here. This is a copy of an actual slave bill of sale for my great-great-great-grandmother, who was the mother of Emmanuel. When our family first came from Africa, they came to Sussex and Southampton County, Virginia. So my ancestors were owned by Colonel Michael Blow, who was a Revolutionary War soldier. And he had a plantation of about 50 slaves, and he passed in 1797. 15 of them went to his son, Micaiah Blow, including my family. In a couple of years, he became heavily indebted, mortgaged some of the land that he had inherited, and he sold my great-great-great-grandmother at age 10 and her sister at age 12 to the Washingtons, and they brought them here to Robertson County, and there's been 11 generations of our family here since then. And this is another slave bill of sale. There's about 43 slave bills of sale in that collection. And
I was looking for a note.
100 pounds of English money at that time. And this is George A. Washington, and another reason we have so much information. He would go to New Orleans to sell tobacco crops from the plantation. He would go to Virginia to slave auctions, and he would go to New York to invest in the stock market. So while he was away, his wife, his mother, his children, and the overseer would write letters, what's going on the plantation, which slaves ran away, who had a baby, who died, what their neighbors were doing. They even mentioned the Native American that was on the Trail of Tears coming through here. And this is an actual receipt for a runaway slave named Albert, who was born in 1813 and he ran away in 1838. And if you will look back across down the hill, and if you were looking up, you see where the barn is. If you were down there looking up, you would have seen this. And this is some of the slave cabins that were here. And there were 40 of them in 1860, which housed 274 individuals. And in 1860, Wessyngton had the largest slave population in the state of Tennessee. This is another shot of some of the cabins just over the fence here. And this was 1860, had the largest slave population. And in total, there were 455 individuals enslaved here from 1796 to 1865. How many? 455. This is a receipt where the Washingtons paid taxes on their slaves. So this only lists individuals that are 12 to 50 years old. And so it doesn't include any seniors or children in the family. So I went back and took this document and other documents from the Washingtons, and I recreated all the families and put their exact dates of birth and years.
Can we talk about that?
Sure. Slaves here worked under a task system, which meant the owner assigned a task, so much corn to chop out, tobacco, what have you. And of course, they knew how much work an average man could do in a day, so they set the task to take up their entire day. However, some of the faster workers could accomplish their task early, and they allowed them to raise their own tobacco crops. So this is a list of slaves that raised their own tobacco, and then Washington would keep up with it, and then when he went to New Orleans, then he would purchase things for them that they wanted, luxury items or things like pots, pans, coats, hats, furniture. And this is a tobacco field here at Wessyngton. And in 1860, the slaves here produced 250,000 pounds of dark fire tobacco, making this the largest tobacco plantation in the United States of America and the second largest in the world. And this would have taken by yields at that time, we would have taken 350 acres. So this would have been farther than I can see. And all that you can see all around here is still Wessyngton now. Mr. Roberts, who owns the place, has 2,735 acres. This is the smokehouse, and that's around the corner if you all want to take a look at it. This is where the meat and everything was stored for the families on the plantation. And each week on Saturday, the women would line up and they'd be given so many pounds of meal, flour, sugar, and so forth, bacon, depending on the number of people in their households. And this is a picture of former slave women here at Wessyngton in the early 1900s. I was very fortunate when I started my research because there were probably 25 or so individuals who were children or grandchildren of Wessyngton slaves, ranging in age from 80 to 107 years old. This is my cousin Joseph Washington, and I met him the day he turned 102 years old. Wow. And so he lived next door to my great-great-grandfather and mother, and so I brought a number of pictures to show him, and he could tell a story about each one of them. And I said, did you know my great-great-grandfather and mother? And he said, of course I knew them. He said, we lived in handshaking distance. I said, what's that? He said, we live so close together you can reach out and shake your neighbor's hand. And he also said, my great-great-grandfather had a beautiful singing voice, and he even sang some of the songs to me that my great-great-grandfather used to lead at their prayer service. This is Ann Nixon Cooper, and this is the lady President Obama mentioned voted for him when she was over 100 years old. And she died 19 days before she turned 108 years old. So I was able to interview her and get many stories from her as well. Before the Civil War ended, which some of the slaves, especially the men, started emancipating themselves before they were officially freed. Some of them ran off to Nashville, all over the place. After the Civil War, some of them came back. This is a picture of my great-great-grandfather and mother with some of their children and grandchildren. And this was taken in the late 1800s. And this is picture of my great-great-grandfather, great-great-grandmother, and another lady who was enslaved here at Wessyngton. This is Daniel Gardner and his wife, Melissa, and there are more African Americans in our county carrying the Gardner surname than any other surname. They had 18 children, so I'm pretty contributing. This is Marion Sims Green, and she was born a slave here at Wessyngton, and her father was Benjamin Sims, the overseer. Well, her father was the overseer on the plantation. And then this gentleman was owned by the Cheatham family, and he was the son of Colonel Cheatham that owned his business partner. This is a picture of Rachel and Wiley Terry. They were born enslaved here, and I got this from their daughter who passed away a week before she turned 102. And so Rachel and Wiley and two of their sons purchased 429 acres of land, part of the land that they were formerly enslaved on, and some of this property is still held by their direct descendants. After emancipation, some of the former slaves returned here to Wessyngton, and the Washingtons also hired other African Americans and white families that sharecropped on the plantation. And this is a white family of sharecroppers here in the late 1800s. And this is Wesley Williams and Fannie Williams, and they were also African American sharecroppers here at Wessyngton. Now, Fannie looks distinctively Native American, and some of her grandchildren say Grandma Fannie was full-blooded Cherokee. I had the DNA test ran on one of her great-great-grandsons that's a close friend of mine, and it showed that she had African ancestry through her mother's line. I had another one of her descendants, one of her great-granddaughters, to take a DNA composition test, and it showed that she had 18% Native American ancestry, which would have been equivalent if she'd have been half. They said that she was a psychic. She read fortunes with decks of cards, and she poisoned one of her daughters-in-law to death that she didn't like. So she This is their son, Sally Terry. He and his family, and they're the first African Americans that we could document to own an automobile, and this is them in front of their 1918 car. They also donated some of their land to start an African American school before the county.
Yeah.
And this is Granville, Washington, and he was said to be the son of George A. Washington, who owned the place. And there's a distinct resemblance between the two. So,
and was he a slave, or he was the son?
He was enslaved. He was the son of the plantation owner, but he was still enslaved. And this was taken in Adams, Tennessee in 1892. And this is Granville's son, Foster, who was the coachman on the plantation.
Who was the what?
He was the coachman. He drove the coach.
Oh, coachman.
And this is the granddaughter of a Wessyngton slave with her school class in the early 1900s. And on this photograph, you have as many, which was uncommon, as many boys in class as there are girls, and which was unusual because most of the time boys had to work out in the fields and didn't get an education. And this is a photograph of some of the former slaves from Wessyngton and the baptism from the Antioch Baptist Church. And former slaves here and others in the community established the Antioch Baptist Church in 1869. They also hired one of the Fisk Jubilee singers as a teacher there. And parents had to pay $1 per month per child for their children's education, but they realized the significance of it. And I found also people as old as 40 or 50 years old were going to school to learn how to read and write. And this is a photograph of the Washington family. This was taken the same day as the photograph I saw in my social studies textbook, and it's right there on that porch where it was taken in 1891. And this is a layout of the plantation in 1892. When George A. Washington died, he wanted his son, who later became a congressman, Joseph II, he got what's called the home place. And then the rest of the children drew lots out of a hat to determine which part of the plantation that they would receive as an inheritance. And this was 13,100 acres in one continuous farm. Wow. 13,100 acres. And this is a trail from the trip Mr. Washington and the slaves would have taken from Virginia to Tennessee. And some some of the slaves passed on to their descendants that they walked every step of the way. And this would have taken about 2.5 months. Mr. Washington put a stipulation in his will that some of his children wouldn't get their full inheritance until they're 30 years old. So one of his sons, George A. Washington II, built this home called Washington Hall. It was 3 stories and had 44 rooms. And some of the crowned heads of Europe had been entertained there. And many of you seen, no doubt, Gone with the Wind and recall the staircase that Scarlett O'Hara falls down. It was fashioned after the staircase in this house.
Where is that house here?
That house burned. You all came that way. Did y'all see a fence that said Washington Hall on it?
Maybe.
Okay, that's where it used to be. Then Mr. Washington's daughter built this home called Glen Raven. And it had 25 rooms. And she and her brother stayed in a fierce competition with one another, trying to outdo each other, having lavish parties, and they both lost their homes doing so.
So is that still?
We passed.
Now this house is still standing.
Okay.
And it's on Bible.
In 2015, descendants of the Washingtons, who own descendants of the plantation owners, donated funds to have this erected in the slave cemetery here, and it has the names of everyone that ever was enslaved here that I was able to document, which is 455 individuals. And there's 100 people buried there that I could document. And then based on ground penetrating radar, there's estimated to be 200 individuals in that cemetery. So we had a dedication ceremony at that time in October 20. Where that barn is, back across that field where you can see all the trees. The Washingtons, when they first bought property, they lived there. And then when some of the first slaves passed, they buried them there. And then when they got this property up here, they continued buried there. And then this is a spiritual on the back that says, "Walk with me, Lord, walk with me while I'm on this tedious journey. I want Jesus to walk with me." So we had a dedication ceremony, and there was about 50 of the white Washingtons that attended, and there was about 200 of us African American descendants. In the early 2000s, I started the Wessyngton DNA Project, where I collected DNA samples from various families who were enslaved here, and I was able to tell where they came from. And so one of the white Washingtons said, "John, we've always been told that we were closely related to President George Washington." And so they only had one Washington male living at that time, so they convinced him he wanted to remain anonymous, but they convinced him to do the test. And it proved that they were related to President George Washington, but it was going back like 1,200 years, much farther than what they thought. So what had happened, President Washington's great-grandfather, John Washington, came to America in 1767. The Washington's ancestor, John Washington, came a year later, and for years they thought they were the same person, but they weren't. So they were disappointed about that. And in 2014, the Tennessee State Museum did an exhibit called "Slaves and Slaveholders of Wessyngton Plantation," which showed how plantation evolved from a small farm to being the largest tobacco plantation in America. And this is from a model. And this model is at the Robertson County Museum in Springfield. And this shows like the big house, the blacksmith shops, and so forth, and the slave houses. And then there's a legend on the back if you all want to check that out. Now, I'm going to show you a family tree that I did of my family. It starts in 1760. And I did this by hand.
How long did that take?
It took me 12 hours to do this one.
Only 12 hours.
I could do that in a year, I swear.
Right? That's what he said, 12 hours. I was thinking, about 6 months.
Yeah.
12 hours.
How many names are on there?
1,000.
Oh, wow.
Nice penmanship.
Yes, very nice.
Good night.
You're out. It must have been, sorry, I couldn't get it. There you go. I think I got you.
My great aunt always said that she died when she was 99. She said that my ancestors found me instead of me finding them.
It is actually.
You got some long days ago.
And this is another family tree of another family that came. They had a family reunion and they said, "John, you know more about our family than we do, so would you do a family tree?" And there's 1,500 names on this one. It took me 36 hours to do this one.
Hey, now, is that the Terry family that were in some of the pictures? Okay. Oh,
Yeah. The Terrors came here in 1813.
that's really cool.
And any of you know Method Man, the rapper? This is his family.
Is that right?
Method
know
Man-
that?
Huh?
Does he know that?
I sent his mother this same family tree. And one of his nephews sent me an email, I think Wednesday, wanting to know more about the family. So I said, you hit the jackpot. Now, they have programs on Family Tree Maker, but if you did it, it would probably reach from here to that house. So I can do it by hand, and it can be reduced down to 11 by 17.
So are you on Ancestry? Or, okay, so you're able to have like if families want to come in and see, you've got all your research done.
And I've got these in. I was doing all this before they were leaving email.
Yeah.
How long have you been doing this, John?
Bought by Ancestry.
How
Since I
long
was
is it?
13 and I'm 58 now. And this is one that's done on a program on Family Tree Maker. So this can't be reduced down to 11 by 17 or anything else that's measured.
It's so pretty.
You single-handedly saved so much history.
Yeah.
So there's not a week that goes back and someone from somewhere contacts me.
So is this your full-time work? No. So you have time, 12, 36 hours a week?
Yeah, I make time. And I can't calculate the hours that I've spent.
Right. I got a question.
Yes.
How do you come to grips with the fact that you have to dig for this information that it's not readily available? Just even like we've been here just a day and a half and heard about tobacco farming being the #1 crop and all that. This is the first mention of slaves helping with that.
Oh, really?
So how do you come to grips with, like, okay, I know these are my ancestors, but I'm not sitting around the family fireplace hearing about my ancestors. I have to dig through some old documents, or I have to go here and there to get that.
Well, in my family, and when I was a kid, even before I saw the picture, I always hung around older people, and my friends would tease me, "You already up on the old people," all of that. And so when I got my book published, they said, "Well, we should have been doing the same." But I can't remember ever not knowing. Of course, I didn't know who they were, but my mother would always make it a point saying, "You're kin to such and such," and I wouldn't just accept you saying such and such is my cousin. I'd want you to break it down like her grandmother, my grandfather, sister, brother, like that. So pretty much, like off the top of my head, pretty much anybody in the black community in Springfield, I can tell you immediately who their great grandparents were. So when I would be doing research for myself, because this is small enough where the town is small enough where you pretty much know everyone. So I would see their ancestors' names, so I will record that because I say sometime in the future somebody's going to ask me about this, so I'll already have it. So when I was a small kid, my grandfather used to take me for a ride in the country every Sunday, and often we would pass the entrance gate, and my grandfather would say, "That's Washington, where your grandmother's family came from." Well, at 5, I knew my grandmother was a Washington, but that's as far as it went. But when I started doing the research, I was able to interview a lot of people, so I got the information easily as far as that was concerned. And then fortunately, in the Washington papers, I could back up what they were telling me. Like all these stories, 90% of what they told me, I could back up with the documents, and that's, most people don't have that.
Right.
Yeah.
That's that part.
That's the part.
That most people don't have
Right.
that. Yeah. Well, I mean, most
Yes.
people that look like me.
You mentioned that your great-great-grandfather lived here until 1907.
Yes.
So that's, 40 years after emancipation. What did that look like post-Civil War?
But he worked as cook for 55 years, so he stayed here till he died.
So he
But
cooked
free
while he was a
and
slave
taken
and then
one.
cooked while he was free.
And so some people say, well, why did some of them come back after they had been enslaved here? Well, a lot of people, most whites lost everything they had during the Civil War. So some of them hired people to sharecrop, and then when it came time to get paid, they didn't have the money to pay them. So, of course, the people here knew what kind of financial situation the Washingtons was in. Actually, Washington, based on his investment strategy, was even wealthier, even with all the slaves gone and everything, than he was before the Civil War. So they knew if they worked here, at least they were going to get paid. And he paid them more than like the average person paid.
So the work he did as a slave, he later got paid to do.
Any final questions before we wrap up?
What would you say is the relationship now between your, ancestors, the Black Washingtons and the White Washingtons?
I have a very close relationship from the beginning. When I first started doing the research, they were very instrumental in providing documents. And when I was writing the book, one of the Washington descendants say, hey, John is writing this book. It's not just their family history, it's all of ours. We need to cooperate. If you got pictures, you've got documents, well, you need to cough it up. And so they did.
That's very supportive.
The monument in the cemetery cost $30,000. They contributed funds for that. And then one Washington descendant alone gave me $22,000 to have it fenced. Wow. So they'll even call me, hey John, how are we related to such and such? And so I pretty much tell them off the top of my head. And when we had the exhibit here at the State Museum, some of them came out here to a tour. So I had them to take a picture in the same spot as their ancestors on the one you seen earlier. And they were just standing there. I said, what are y'all doing? They said, well, you really need to be in this picture too, because if it hadn't been for you, we wouldn't even know each other, because they're scattered all over the country. And I've been telling them for years they need to have a family reunion because they didn't know each other. So that brought them together, which most of the African American families that came from here, we've been having family reunions for 80 and 100 years. So we know who, but that was the first time that they ever got together.
Who lives in this house now?
Glenn Roberts, and he and his wife purchased Wessyngton in 1983. And up to its sale, it was the largest farm in America, still held by direct descendants. So it was in the Washington family 187 years, and it's been in Mr. Roberts' possession since then.
You said there's 2,700 acres now? Roughly.
2735, yeah.
But at one point it was what?
13,100.
Wow. Any last quick questions?
Have you digitized all these documents and things that you found in people's boxes and
the documents in the archives is on microfilm. They're working on getting it digitized.
It'd be a shame, at some point, you're not going to be here. I've
got instruction in my will for all of my records to be digitized and deposited at the state archives and our local archives.
So hopefully
family longevity, he's gonna be on time.
Man, you got it. You got a team.
Like with these, I pass them out at family reunion, so everyone has a copy. Everybody's got pictures.
And you do each of them by hand?
No, I do one, and then they're reproduced. Yeah. But initially I do them by hand. I think they do better.